There was a moment, repeated thousands of times across Europe, that almost never appears in history books. A man sits alone at a desk late at night. A candle burns low. The room is quiet enough that he can hear his own breathing. Earlier that day, he spoke the usual words in public. He nodded at the right moments. He repeated the language everyone else used. Now, alone, he does something dangerous. He follows a thought to the end. Not a rebellious thought. Not an emotional one. A calm, reasonable thought. A thought that cannot be spoken aloud without cost, because men who followed this thought too openly did not merely lose arguments. They lost positions, trust, reputations, entire futures erased not for what they did, but for what they allowed themselves to conclude. And yet, the thought persists. For most of human history, this moment could not happen. Disbelief was not an option, because belief was not a position. It was infrastructure. It surrounded you before you developed the ability to question it. God structured time. Bells told you when to wake, when to work, when to stop. The calendar itself bent around the sacred, slicing the year into fasts and feasts, so that time did not feel like an empty stretch you had to justify. Without this structure, time would become unmarked, interchangeable, accountable to nothing. God structured morality. Good and evil were not negotiated. They were issued. You did not invent values. You inherited them, along with the certainty that someone was watching whether you obeyed or not. Without that watcher, obedience would have to explain itself. God structured suffering. When crops failed, when children died, when disease hollowed out entire villages, there was an explanation that did not require interpretation. God was testing. God was punishing. God was correcting. Pain meant something, even when it was unbearable. Without that meaning, suffering would arrive naked. And most importantly, belief structured responsibility. You were not alone with your choices. Every action echoed upward. Every thought mattered. Even when no human authority was present, there was a witness. A final appeal. A ledger where nothing slipped through unnoticed. Without that ledger, responsibility would fall entirely on the individual, with no appeal upward. This mattered more than modern people like to admit, because a world without that witness is not merely quieter, it is heavier. In early modern Europe, God was not a private comfort. He was a public fact, enforced by institutions, rituals, and fear. The church did not exist alongside society. It was woven into law, education, family structure, and identity itself. To be born was to be placed immediately into a moral order you did not choose. You did not ask what life meant. You were told. And in return for obedience, there was stability. This stability is often erased when we talk about superstition and dogma, but it was real. It absorbed fear. It contained uncertainty. It prevented questions from spreading too far, too fast. Everyone knew where they stood in the universe. The peasant knew why he suffered. The king knew why he ruled. The priest knew why he mediated between heaven and earth. The hierarchy was brutal, but it was legible, and legibility mattered. It allowed people to endure lives they did not control by believing those lives fit into a larger design. Even rebellion stayed inside this structure. Heretics did not deny God. They argued about him. They claimed he had been misunderstood, corrupted, misrepresented. No one yet imagined removing him entirely, because no one knew what would replace him. When cracks first appeared, they did not look like atheism. They looked like competence. The world began to explain itself. The heavens moved according to mathematics. Bodies obeyed anatomy. Disease followed patterns that prayer did not reliably interrupt. Nature behaved as if it were following rules, whether anyone asked it to or not. The earth moved. The heavens obeyed calculation. Bodies decayed without consulting theology. At first, this was survivable. God could still be the author of those rules. The clockmaker who designed the mechanism and stepped away. But something changed when explanation began to feel sufficient, when thunder no longer required angels, when illness no longer required demons, when chance and necessity accounted for events once loaded with intention. God did not disappear. He receded. And receding authority does not provoke rebellion. It produces hesitation. People continued to obey, but less automatically, less confidently. They followed rules they could no longer fully justify, enforced by institutions that could no longer convincingly explain where their authority came from. This created a dangerous gap. A God who exists but does nothing is not the same as no God at all. But psychologically, the difference is thinner than it appears. Because once intervention stops, belief becomes habit, and habits, once examined, weaken. This is where the late-night thought becomes possible, a thought that cannot survive daylight, a thought that lives only in isolation. If the world runs without interruption, if nature does not pause, intervene, or correct itself, what exactly is God still doing here? Most Enlightenment figures sensed the danger of this question and stopped before it reached its conclusion. They preferred balance. God as moral guarantor. God as necessary fiction. God as social glue. They feared what would happen if that glue dissolved, and they were right to fear it, because removing God was not like removing a tyrant or a superstition. It was like removing gravity. Everything stayed in place at first. The habits continued. The language remained. Morality still sounded the same. But the invisible force holding it all together was gone, and without it, a different kind of question emerged. Not, is this allowed? But, why should I care? That question did not yet have an answer, and the few people who were willing to ask it fully understood something the rest did not. If God was unnecessary to explain the universe, then he was unnecessary everywhere, not just in science, in morality, in meaning, in responsibility. That realization did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as a calm, methodical thought. And once reached, it could not be silenced without dishonesty. What frightened people about a world without God was not collapse. Collapse is loud. It announces itself. It looks like riots, bloodshed, order breaking apart in the streets. For centuries, this was the warning repeated by priests and kings alike. Remove God, they said, and society will tear itself apart. But this fear misunderstood the danger. The real threat was not chaos. It was continuity, a world that kept functioning. People still woke up, still worked, still married, still buried their dead, still spoke the same moral language they always had, but now without any guarantee that any of it mattered beyond the moment itself. Because meaning, when it is no longer anchored above, does not vanish immediately. It lingers, like muscle memory, like a habit whose reason has been forgotten. People continued to speak of duty, virtue, sin, and responsibility long after the metaphysical foundation beneath those words had begun to erode. The language survived the belief. The rituals outlived their justification, and that made things unstable. Because a rule without a reason eventually feels arbitrary, and an obligation without a witness eventually feels negotiable. This is where pressure began to build, quietly. Morality had always leaned on something external. Even when people disobeyed, they knew what they were disobeying. The boundary existed. Transgression meant something. But in a universe governed only by matter and motion, where causes led to effects without intention, where no final judgment waited at the end of time, the moral landscape flattened. Not suddenly, not visibly, but structurally. Responsibility began to move inward, and inward responsibility is heavier than obedience ever was. If there is no cosmic judge, then every action ends here. In the social world, in the psychological world, in consequences administered by other human beings, imperfectly, inconsistently, and often unfairly. Justice becomes approximate. Punishment becomes contingent. Forgiveness loses its metaphysical backing. And worst of all, suffering loses its explanation. A child's death is no longer a test, A famine is no longer a warning. A plague is no longer a message. They are simply events. Brutal ones, indifferent ones. And once this is accepted, the universe no longer speaks. It operates. This realization did not make people immoral. It made them anxious, because belief had not only explained the world, it had absorbed psychological weight. It had carried fear, guilt, despair, and uncertainty on behalf of the individual. Without it, that weight had nowhere to go. People were left alone with their choices in a way they had never been before. This is where many Enlightenment thinkers hesitated. They sensed that reason could explain the world, but they were not convinced it could carry the burden that belief had once carried effortlessly. So, they stopped short. They compromised. They kept God as a moral placeholder, a necessary idea, a useful fiction. Not because they were naive, but because they feared what would happen if ordinary people were told the truth too quickly. They feared a society where individuals were left alone with their actions, with no higher appeal, no eternal justification, no promise that endurance would be rewarded elsewhere. They feared despair. But despair is not what arrives first. What arrives first is exposure. Exposure to the fact that if nothing is watching, then meaning must be built, not received. And not everyone can carry that task. Some people fail under it. They hesitate. They rationalize. They defer responsibility. They look for substitutes. This is where the private questions began to appear. Questions that did not yet dare to speak their own name. Why should I restrain myself when no one is watching? Why should I suffer for a principle that offers no guarantee? Why should I obey rules whose authority I can no longer explain? These questions did not surface publicly. They survived in isolation, in letters never sent, in journals locked away, in conversations that stopped when someone else entered the room. This is why the period appears calm in hindsight. The conflict was internal. But calm here did not mean peace. It meant latency, like pressure building behind a wall that had not yet cracked, because once obligation becomes questionable, enforcement must come from somewhere else. And it did. Slowly at first. Law replaced conscience. Surveillance replaced belief. Social pressure replaced divine judgment. Morality did not disappear. It hardened. It became procedural. Rules were followed, not because they were sacred, but because consequences were visible and immediate. This is the part of the story that is often missed. The removal of God did not produce freedom. It produced accountability without mercy, no appeal upward, no forgiveness guaranteed, no cosmic correction waiting at the end. Only cause and effect. This was the cost of honesty, and it terrified people. Because once God is gone, nothing stands between the individual and the full weight of responsibility except other human beings. And other human beings are unreliable judges. This is why so many thinkers tried to stop the process halfway. They wanted reason without vertigo, truth without consequence, freedom without authorship. But the compromise could not hold. Because once belief stops believing itself, silence becomes complicity. To continue invoking God while knowing he no longer explained anything required dishonesty. And dishonesty, when it becomes structural, corrodes trust itself. This is the logic trap the Enlightenment backed into. Either God was necessary, or he was not. If he was necessary, then reason had to stop where belief began. If he was not necessary, then pretending otherwise was a lie. There was no stable middle position. Most thinkers stepped back from this conclusion. But stepping back required something they rarely admitted. It required silence. It required maintaining a language they no longer trusted. It required letting others believe what they themselves could not. And a few people refused, not because they were braver, but because they could not tolerate incoherence. They would not accept a world explained by reason everywhere except where it became uncomfortable. They would not preserve a moral system they no longer believed was true. They would not allow God to remain as an unexamined excuse. Someone would say this plainly, not with rage, not with rebellion, but with precision. Someone would insist that if the universe truly operated without intention, then honesty demanded we accept that fact everywhere. In nature, in morality, in the human mind itself. That person had not yet spoken. But at this point, silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night, others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Enlightenment did not begin as a revolution. It began as a repair job. Most of the men we now group under that name were not trying to tear the world down. They were trying to make it function more smoothly, to remove excess cruelty, to reduce arbitrariness, to replace inherited authority with explanation where possible. They did not see themselves as radicals. They saw themselves as custodians. And custodians learn something quickly. You can repair a structure only until the moment you touch a beam that is load-bearing. After that, you are no longer fixing a building. You are deciding whether it falls. Reason worked. That was the problem. It explained the motion of planets. It explained the circulation of blood. It explained disease, mechanics, optics, and chemistry. And with each successful explanation, something else quietly weakened. The need for God as an active cause. At first, this was manageable, even comforting. God could remain as the designer of the system, the author of natural law, the guarantor of morality, even if he no longer interfered with daily events. This arrangement pleased many. It preserved order while allowing progress. It satisfied reason without terrifying society. But it was unstable. Because it created two kinds of thinkers inside the same movement, those willing to stop, and those who could not. The moderates believed reason was a tool, not a solvent, something to apply carefully, selectively, where it improved life without dissolving the structures that held society together. They feared excess clarity, not because they doubted truth, but because they were managing people. They feared that too much honesty, too quickly applied, would produce not freedom, but overload. A population suddenly responsible for meaning, morality, and self-restraint, without the scaffolding that had always carried those weights. They did not doubt reason's power. They doubted human tolerance for its consequences. So they compromised. They retained God as a moral anchor, even as they quietly accepted that he no longer explained the world. They spoke of natural law, while leaving a lawgiver implied. They defended virtue while detaching it from divine enforcement. This was not hypocrisy. It was containment. A way of keeping the public from looking too closely at what the educated had already begun to suspect. Because suspicion, once widespread, changes behavior, not into violence, into hesitation, into bargaining, into quiet disobedience justified by the same reasoning that had once liberated science. The radicals noticed what the moderates preferred not to examine. The compromise was asymmetric. Reason was allowed everywhere, except where it became dangerous. Nature could be explained mechanistically. Human bodies could be explained materially. History could be explained causally. But morality was treated as exempt. And if reason dissolves superstition everywhere else, why should ethics be immune? If human beings are part of nature, why should their thoughts and choices operate according to different principles? If causes explain motion, appetite, and disease, why should they stop at conscience? These were not rhetorical questions. They were structural ones. And once asked, they did not allow partial answers. The radicals did not accuse the moderates of cowardice. They accused them of inconsistency. You could not argue that nature obeyed universal laws, and then carve out a supernatural exception for human behavior without explanation. You could not strip the universe of intention and then smuggle it back in under the name of morality. You could not demand intellectual honesty in physics while tolerating myth in ethics. To the radicals, this was not prudence. It was evasion. And evasion, they believed, would fail. Because once people sensed that belief had become instrumental rather than true, its authority would erode anyway, not violently, gradually, quietly. Obedience would thin, conviction would soften, language would outlive belief. This was the true danger, not atheism, but belief that no longer believed itself. And this is where the stakes became social rather than philosophical. The most dangerous ideas were not the ones shouted in public. They were the ones that could not be stated publicly at all. Ideas that survived only in private rooms, in cautious letters, in conversations that stopped when the wrong person entered. Silence was not preference. Silence was survival. Voltaire understood this instinctively. He mocked the Church, but recoiled from open atheism. Not because he thought God was true, but because he feared what would replace him. He wanted servants, lawyers, and spouses to believe, not for their sake, but for his. And that is what his position really was. Not balance. Containment. A defensive move against a fear he could not fully articulate, that once the witness in the sky was gone, the witness would have to be built on earth. Law. Surveillance. Punishment. Social coercion. The radicals saw that the question was no longer whether God existed. It was whether he was necessary. And necessity is a higher standard than belief. Once necessity fails, removal becomes inevitable. This is where the Enlightenment stopped being a unified movement, because one side wanted stability first, truth second, and the other refused to accept that order. They argued that postponing the conclusion did not prevent its arrival. It merely delayed the reckoning. Better, they thought, to face the consequences honestly than to inherit a system already hollowed out by compromise. And here was the trap. If you keep God only as a tool, you teach people that belief is negotiable. If you refuse to follow reason to its end, you admit that truth has boundaries. If you hesitate publicly while doubting privately, you make silence itself a choice. At that point, the Enlightenment could still pretend it was deciding. But it was not. It was already committed, and someone would soon give this commitment its most complete, uncompromising form, not as a provocation, but as a system. The compromise could survive only as long as it remained invisible, as long as belief looked sincere, as long as authority sounded confident, as long as moral language still carried weight. But the moment people closest to power stopped believing what they enforced, the structure began to rot from the inside. This did not happen all at once. At first, only a narrow class felt it. The men who read the latest treatises, the physicians who watched prayer fail and medicine succeed, the administrators who enforced laws whose justification they could no longer articulate without qualification. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, belief thinned. Public certainty, private doubt, and asymmetries like this do not remain stable. Because once belief stops convincing the believer, it becomes a performance. And performances require an audience willing to suspend disbelief. That audience began to shrink, not among the poor or uneducated, but among those tasked with maintaining order. Lawyers, clerks, physicians, teachers. The people who translated belief into practice began to understand how provisional it had become. This is where the Enlightenment's civil war hardened. The moderates sensed the danger immediately. They insisted that society could not survive a full withdrawal of belief, that people required an external anchor. That moral obligation without transcendence would collapse into impulse, appetite, and disorder. They believed history supported them. Whenever faith weakened, violence followed. Whenever authority dissolved, cruelty rushed in to fill the vacuum. This fear was not imaginary, but it was misdirected. The radicals did not believe that disbelief caused disorder. They believed dishonesty did. A system that no longer believed its own justifications could not command real loyalty. It could only demand obedience. And obedience without conviction is brittle. It cracks under stress. They watched the moderates preserve God, not as truth, but as scaffolding, a temporary support meant to prevent collapse, while reason continued its work elsewhere. But scaffolding is meant to be removed. Leaving it in place indefinitely does not preserve the structure. It weakens it. Because once people sense that belief is being maintained for them, rather than with them, trust erodes. Authority becomes managerial rather than moral. Rules are followed but not owned. This is where pressure intensified, not because people stopped believing, but because belief no longer believed itself. Religion was no longer defended as true. It was defended as useful. And usefulness is a dangerous justification. Because tools invite redesign. The radicals pushed the logic to its end. If morality truly depended on God, then it would collapse without him anyway. And if it did not collapse, then God was not necessary in the first place. Either way, the conclusion was unavoidable. You could not keep the symbol once its function had failed. This was the pivot. The Enlightenment had reached a point where the question was no longer theological. It was structural. Could a society built on explanation continue to rely on an unexplainable foundation? Could a culture that prized honesty tolerate a belief maintained only because it prevented instability? Could reason be applied everywhere, except where it became socially inconvenient? The moderates answered yes. The radicals answered no. And here is where inevitability entered fully. Because once reason is accepted as the final authority in one domain, it does not recognize sacred exceptions. It does not pause out of respect for tradition. It does not stop because the consequences are uncomfortable. It continues. This is why the compromise failed. Not because radicals attacked it, but because reason eroded it from within. Every scientific explanation reduced the emotional need for divine intervention. Every medical advance weakened the connection between prayer and outcome. Every historical analysis reframed events once attributed to providence as products of circumstance. God remained in language, but not in practice. And a God who survives only in words is already gone. This realization did not produce mass atheism. It produced something quieter and more corrosive. A moral order no longer believed even by those enforcing it. Once that happens, authority must be maintained through other means. Law replaces conscience. Surveillance replaces belief. Punishment replaces confession. Social pressure replaces divine judgment. Morality does not disappear. It hardens. It becomes procedural. Rules are followed not because they are sacred, but because consequences are immediate and visible. The radicals understood this trajectory. They saw that if belief were not removed honestly, it would be replaced silently by force. That societies clinging to moral language without metaphysical conviction would drift toward coercion rather than consent. This was not abstract speculation. They could see it happening. Rules enforced without explanation. Punishments justified without appeal. Obligations demanded without meaning. This was the world taking shape beneath the surface of Enlightenment optimism. The moderates called the radicals reckless. The radicals called the moderates dishonest. And both understood what was truly at stake. Not belief, but responsibility. Because once God is removed, nothing stands between the individual and the consequences of action, except other human beings. No appeal upward. No forgiveness guaranteed. No cosmic correction, only cause and effect, unfolding through bodies, institutions, and time. This was the line no one wanted to cross publicly, because crossing it meant accepting something profoundly unsettling, that human beings were not guided, that history was not going anywhere in particular, that moral systems were inventions, not revelations, That meaning was constructed under pressure, not discovered. To accept this was to abandon the last comforting fiction. Most thinkers refused. They stepped back from the edge and pretended the cliff was not there. But stepping back required something they did not like to name. Silence. Silence about what they already knew. Silence about conclusions they had reached, but would not state. Silence that allowed others to believe what they themselves no longer could. At that point, not crossing the line was no longer neutral. It was a decision. And a small number of people made a different one. They crossed it. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. They asked what the world looked like if every explanation stopped where nature stopped, if thought itself was a product of matter, if desire, conscience, and will were shaped by forces that preceded the individual, if freedom was not sacred, but conditional. They did not ask whether this was comforting. They asked whether it was true. Once asked that way, the question allowed no compromise. God could not remain as a moral placeholder. He could not remain as symbolic comfort. He had to be either necessary or removed. And necessity had failed. At that moment, disbelief stopped being a private doubt. It became a system, a complete account of the world that did not rely on exception, mystery, or appeal. Someone would give this account its most precise form, not as poetry, not as rebellion, but as a cold, comprehensive description of reality. The Enlightenment had delayed this moment as long as it could, but delay was no longer possible. The line had been crossed. The man who would finish this argument did not look dangerous. He did not shout. He did not scandalize. He did not posture as a revolutionary. He hosted dinners. This detail matters because it tells you what kind of rupture was coming. The most radical conclusion of the Enlightenment did not emerge from the streets, or the pulpit, or the barricade. It emerged from a room where people sat comfortably, argued carefully, and drank wine while the world outside continued as usual. There were no manifestos nailed to doors. There were manuscripts passed quietly between hands. The environment was calm. The logic was not. He lived inside the compromise long enough to see exactly where it failed. And once seen, he refused to look away. Unlike the moderates, he was not trying to manage people. He was not interested in how quickly ideas could be absorbed without destabilizing society. He did not ask how much truth the public could tolerate. He asked a different question. What remains if we remove every exception? This was not a rhetorical challenge. It was a methodological one. He approached belief the way a mechanic approaches a system that keeps malfunctioning, not with reverence, not with hostility, with suspicion. If something must be protected from examination, he reasoned, it is probably doing work. it cannot admit to doing. He did not begin by attacking God. He began by refusing to use him. What made this refusal dangerous was not how loudly it was expressed, but how carefully it had to move. These ideas did not announce themselves. They circulated, passed between trusted hands, read in rooms where voices lowered instinctively, not because anyone was listening, but because everyone understood that some conclusions could not yet survive daylight. Silence here was not modesty. It was containment. Not everyone who encountered the argument rejected it. Many simply learned not to repeat it. In his writing, God does not rage, punish, or command. He simply vanishes from the explanatory chain. Not removed violently, but rendered unnecessary. Events are explained without appeal. Human behavior is traced to causes. Desire, fear, conscience, and will are treated as phenomena rather than mysteries. This is why his work felt colder than his contemporaries. He did not offer consolation. He offered completion. Most Enlightenment thinkers had already accepted that nature operated without intention, that planets did not care about prayer, that disease did not respond to virtue, that physical processes obeyed laws regardless of belief. What they could not accept was the extension of this logic inward, into the human mind, into morality, into the idea of choice itself. This is where he refused to stop. If human beings are part of nature, he argued, then they obey the same rules. Thought is not an exception. Conscience is not a miracle. Freedom is not sacred by default. It is conditional, shaped by biology, by environment, by history, by forces that precede the individual and continue long after. This was not cynicism. It was consistency. And consistency, in this context, was devastating because it removed the final hiding place. If human behavior is caused, then responsibility must be redefined. If morality emerges from human needs, then divine command is surplus. If suffering has no intention behind it, then endurance earns no cosmic reward. None of this was new in fragments. What was new was the refusal to stop assembling them. He did not speak in metaphors. He did not soften conclusions. He did not pause to reassure. He wrote as if the universe had no obligation to be comforting, and he expected his readers to do the same. This is why his work circulated carefully, not because it was inflammatory, but because it was complete. Incomplete ideas can be debated. Complete systems are harder to contain. Once accepted, they reorganize how everything else is understood. Under this view, religion becomes a historical artifact, not a source of truth, but a human response to fear and uncertainty. Morality becomes a social technology, a way of regulating behavior, not a reflection of divine will. Freedom becomes a feeling rather than a fact, a subjective experience arising from complex causes, not a metaphysical gift. None of this was meant to humiliate humanity, but it stripped away the last excuse. If the universe does not care, then nothing excuses cruelty. If suffering has no meaning, then preventing it becomes urgent. If no one is watching, then responsibility belongs entirely to us. This is the cost that frightened even those sympathetic to reason, because once stated plainly, it removed every appeal. No fate to blame, no providence to invoke, no divine plan to soften failure. Only cause and effect, only action and consequence, only human beings judging one another with no higher authority to hide behind. This is why the man who completed this argument did not publish under his own name, not because he feared punishment, but because he understood what he was doing. He was not attacking belief. He was ending it, not emotionally, structurally. He was not saying God was false. He was showing that God was unnecessary. And once necessity collapses, belief follows. This was not a call to despair. It was a demand for honesty, an honesty that required people to accept the full psychological weight of a universe without intention, to live without appeals, to build meaning without guarantees, to take responsibility without metaphysical reinforcement. Most thinkers sensed where this logic led and turned away. He did not, and that refusal is what made him dangerous, not because he wanted to destroy order, but because he was willing to describe reality without protecting anyone from it. Forced a question that had been hovering at the edges of enlightenment, thought to stand at the center. If the world truly runs on its own terms, why are we still pretending otherwise? Once the argument was complete, it could no longer be contained as opinion. It did not depend on temperament, rebellion, or disbelief. It did not require anger toward religion or resentment toward authority. It required only one concession: that the universe explains itself. Everything else followed. Under this view, nature does not point beyond itself. It does not gesture toward intention, purpose, or design that must be inferred. Matter moves because it must. Causes produce effects because they always have, and human beings are not exempt from this process. This was the step that made people recoil. Not the denial of God, but the denial of exception. If thought emerges from the brain, then it obeys physical laws. If desire arises from need, then it is shaped by circumstance. If conscience develops socially, then it reflects conditions, not commandments. Nothing floats freely. Nothing originates itself. Choice does not disappear in this system. It changes meaning. What people experience as freedom is no longer a metaphysical power hovering above nature. It is a sensation produced by complexity. A feeling that arises when causes are too numerous to track consciously. Freedom becomes experiential, not absolute. And responsibility, once stripped of divine reinforcement, becomes heavier rather than lighter. This is where critics often misunderstood the argument. They assumed that removing God would remove obligation. The opposite was true. Once no appeal exists beyond the world, every consequence remains here. Nothing is deferred. Nothing is forgiven by a higher court. No suffering is redeemed by intention. Pain is simply pain. Cruelty is simply cruelty. And the responsibility for both lies entirely with human systems. This was not a license for indulgence. It was a demand for precision. If human beings act according to causes, then those causes must be understood. Education becomes moral work. Environment becomes ethical infrastructure. Institutions become instruments of behavior, not neutral frameworks. Blame loses its cosmic dimension. Prevention gains urgency. Punishment loses its sacred character. Reform gains rational necessity. This is why the system frightened people who otherwise supported reason. Because it removed the emotional shortcuts that belief had provided. No one could say, "It was meant to happen." No one could say, "They will be judged elsewhere." No one could say, "This suffering has a higher purpose." Every failure remained unresolved. Every injustice stayed human. And that meant solutions had to be human too. There was no refuge in mystery. This is why the argument was not merely atheistic. It was administrative. It implied that societies were responsible for the behaviors they produced. That cruelty reflected structure, not sin. That virtue emerged from conditions, not divine favor. Under this view, prisons, schools, families, laws, and economies were not morally neutral. They were engines, and engines could be redesigned. This is where many readers panicked, because once morality is treated as a product of systems, then moral superiority becomes suspect. No one stands outside causation. No one can claim exemption. There are no pure villains. There are no saints. Only outcomes. Only outcomes. This was deeply unsettling, not because it excused wrongdoing, but because it eliminated the comfort of condemnation. It demanded understanding instead of judgment. And understanding, when applied consistently, dissolves the emotional satisfaction of blame. This is why even those sympathetic to materialism hesitated. They sensed that this view stripped away not only God, but a certain kind of psychological relief. The relief of thinking that evil was chosen freely rather than produced. The relief of believing that goodness was earned metaphysically rather than cultivated. The relief of assuming that the universe cared whether we succeeded or failed. It did not. And that indifference changed everything. Once the universe no longer cared, caring became entirely human. Meaning was no longer discovered. It was constructed under constraint. Ethics were no longer revealed. They were engineered. And responsibility was no longer shared with heaven. It was pooled entirely among people. This is why the system did not spread loudly. It spread cautiously, because once absorbed, it could not be forgotten. It altered how one saw children, criminals, rulers, and oneself. It dissolved the idea of moral desert and replaced it with causal explanation, not as excuse, as diagnosis. And diagnoses demand intervention. This was the final rupture. The Enlightenment had promised clarity. But this clarity came with a cost no one wanted to advertise. A world that explains itself offers no consolation. It offers only leverage. You can understand why something happens. You cannot pretend it happens for a reason. You can reduce suffering. You cannot justify it. You can build better systems. You cannot blame the universe when they fail. This was the price of coherence. And once paid, there was no return to softened belief, no moral placeholders, no divine backup, only a continuous chain of cause and effect, linking biology to behavior, society to conscience, structure to outcome. The system was complete, and completeness was the danger. Because partial disbelief can be absorbed, total explanation cannot. Once accepted, it reorganized everything it touched. What unsettled people was not that the system explained so much. It was that it left nothing open. No remainder. No hidden corridor where mystery could be stored for comfort. The argument closed like a sealed circuit. Once entered, it offered no exits upward or outward. Everything fed back into the same loop of cause and effect. There was nowhere else to send responsibility once it returned. Religion became history. Morality became design. Freedom became experience. Responsibility became collective. Nothing escaped. This is why the man who articulated this system did not argue with his opponents. There was nothing to debate. Either the universe operated according to consistent principles, or it did not, and every discovery suggested that it did. Once that was accepted, the rest followed automatically, not as rebellion, as consequence. The Enlightenment had spent decades circling this conclusion. Now it had been stated plainly. and once stated, silence itself became a choice. The danger was not that the argument existed. It was that it could be understood. Once articulated clearly, it did not behave like other forbidden ideas. It did not shock. It did not provoke outrage. It did not demand allegiance. It simply waited. Anyone who encountered it had two options. They could reject it, or they could carry it quietly and pretend it had not changed anything. Most chose the second. This is how containment actually works. Not through censorship alone, but through social pressure. Through silence. Through the unspoken agreement that some conclusions are better left unexamined, even when they are already known. The system that had been laid out did not circulate widely, but it circulated strategically, among those capable of following it, among those already accustomed to thinking in terms of cause and effect, among people who sensed that the Enlightenment's optimism rested on an increasingly thin foundation. The reaction was not uniform. Some dismissed it as cold, mechanical, inhuman. Others recognized its precision and felt its weight immediately. But almost everyone understood the same thing. This was not something you could say in public, not because it was offensive, but because it left no room for reassurance. A society can tolerate doubt. It struggles to tolerate closure. Partial disbelief can be debated. It can be softened. It can be absorbed into existing language. Complete explanation cannot. Once accepted, it forces a reckoning everywhere at once. This is why the first response was not argument. It was avoidance. People spoke around the ideas. They discussed adjacent themes. They adopted fragments while rejecting the whole. Determinism without responsibility. Materialism without consequence. Critique without completion. The goal was not to refute the system. It was to keep it from solidifying, because once it did, it would no longer be possible to invoke God casually, or morality abstractly, or freedom sentimentally. Every appeal would demand justification, and justification in a closed system has limits. Institutions sensed this pressure before the public did. Churches understood that the threat was no longer heresy. Heresy argued within belief. This argument bypassed belief entirely. Lawmakers felt it too. A morality grounded in causation rather than command raised uncomfortable questions about punishment, guilt, and desert. If behavior was shaped, then responsibility was complicated. If responsibility was complicated, then authority lost its moral simplicity. Educators felt it perhaps most acutely. If thought was a product of conditions, then education was not neutral. It became moral engineering. and that implication was difficult to accept without admitting how much power institutions already exercised quietly. The fear was not that people would stop believing. It was that belief would stop working. A belief that survives only because it is not examined is already fragile. A belief that cannot survive examination becomes dangerous to defend. This is why containment intensified, not through bans alone, but through tone. Ideas were labeled extreme, unbalanced, impractical, detached from real human needs. These labels mattered. They shifted the debate away from truth and toward temperament. The argument was not wrong, critics suggested. It was unlivable. And unlivable ideas, they implied, should not be taken seriously. This was a familiar move. When belief could no longer defend itself on explanatory grounds, it shifted to psychological ones. It appealed not to truth, but to comfort, not to coherence, but to stability. The system was accused of stripping meaning, of reducing humanity to mechanisms, of offering no guidance, but this missed the point. The argument did not deny meaning. It denied guarantee. It did not remove morality. It removed its metaphysical exemption. It did not excuse cruelty. It removed the comfort of blaming it on anything other than human systems. That was what made it threatening. Because once responsibility is fully human, it becomes political. And politics prefers ambiguity. Ambiguity allows flexibility. Flexibility allows power to adapt. Clear causation invites accountability. This is why the reaction remained quiet but firm. No formal denunciations were necessary. The ideas were simply kept at the margins, discussed as curiosities, mentioned as extremes, acknowledged, then set aside. But marginalization has limits, because ideas that explain too much do not disappear. They wait. They resurface when circumstances demand them, when punishment no longer satisfies, when suffering can no longer be justified, when institutions fail and excuses run out. This is when systems that explain themselves become attractive, not because they are comforting, but because they are usable. The Enlightenment had promised improvement, but improvement without explanation creates impatience, and impatience seeks clarity. This is why the argument continued to circulate quietly, not as a movement, as a tool, a way of understanding behavior when moral language failed, a way of diagnosing systems when blame became unconvincing, a way of speaking honestly when silence felt like complicity. The cost of this honesty was isolation. Those who accepted the system found it difficult to speak freely, not because they were persecuted, but because conversation itself became constrained. Everyday moral language felt imprecise. Common appeals sounded hollow. They learned to translate, to soften conclusions, to speak in fragments. This fragmentation kept the peace. But it also guaranteed that the tension would return. Because once a system exposes the scaffolding beneath belief, you cannot unknow what is holding the structure up. You can only decide whether to keep pretending. This was the state the Enlightenment entered, not collapse. Suspension. A culture continuing to function while carrying an unresolved contradiction. Belief without conviction. Morality without metaphysics. Responsibility without appeal. The argument had not destroyed these things. It had revealed their dependence. And once revealed, dependence becomes vulnerability. The next question was unavoidable. How long could a society rely on beliefs it no longer trusted to do the work they once did? Containment can delay exposure. It cannot replace function. For a time, the Enlightenment lived off inherited momentum. The habits of belief continued even as conviction weakened. People still spoke the old language. Institutions still invoked familiar justifications. Morality still sounded authoritative. But something had shifted underneath. Belief had once done work. It absorbed fear. It softened suffering. It justified punishment. It restrained behavior even when no one was watching. When belief stopped doing that work reliably, the work did not disappear. It was reassigned. This reassignment was gradual, uneven, and largely unacknowledged. At first, nothing looked different. People still behaved. Rules were still followed. Order remained intact. But the reason for obedience had changed. What had once been internal became external. Where conscience weakened, supervision expanded. Where moral certainty thinned, procedure thickened. Where divine judgment receded, human judgment intensified. This was not tyranny. It was administration. Institutions did not suddenly become cruel. They became precise. Rules multiplied. Categories hardened. Exceptions narrowed. Behavior was no longer guided by meaning. It was managed by consequence. This shift revealed something uncomfortable. Belief had never been merely symbolic. It had been infrastructural. Once it weakened, society had to compensate. And compensation has a cost. Punishment began to carry more weight because there was no longer forgiveness guaranteed elsewhere. Surveillance became more acceptable because trust had lost its metaphysical backing. Law grew more detailed because conscience could no longer be assumed. Morality became legible. And legibility invites control. People complied, but differently. Rules were followed without belief. obligations met without attachment, behavior remained orderly, yet inwardly detached. Individuals learned to act as if meaning still governed them, while privately navigating by consequence alone. What had once felt shared now felt imposed, and that subtle shift altered obedience itself. This was the moment the moderates had feared, not chaos, but exposure. Exposure of how much effort was required to produce good behavior. Once belief could no longer be relied upon to do it quietly. The radicals had predicted this. They had warned that preserving belief as a fiction would not maintain order. It would merely postpone the reckoning and make it harsher when it arrived. Because once morality is enforced rather than believed, resistance does not disappear. It adapts. People obey, but they no longer consent internally. They follow rules, but they do not identify with them. They comply without conviction. This creates a fragile stability, one that looks calm, but carries pressure. And pressure seeks release. At this stage, the Enlightenment faced a choice it could no longer avoid. It could continue pretending that belief still anchored morality, or it could admit that something else had taken its place. That something was not reason alone. It was power. Not power as domination, but power as coordination, as the ability to shape behavior through incentives, surveillance, and consequence. Once this was recognized, the moral language surrounding institutions began to shift. Punishment was justified, not as retribution, but as deterrence. Education was framed not as formation of souls, but as optimization of outcomes. Governance emphasized stability, predictability, and compliance. These were rational goals. They were also revealing. They treated human beings less as moral agents guided by meaning, and more as variables within systems. This was not cruelty. It was coherence applied without sentiment. And coherence, when stripped of belief, feels cold. This is where resistance quietly returned, not as rebellion against authority, but as discomfort with being managed. People sensed that they were being treated as predictable rather than responsible, that their actions were anticipated rather than judged, that moral language was being used to justify systems that no longer believed in moral exemption. The result was not immediate revolt. It was alienation. Alienation from institutions that spoke of virtue while relying on procedure, from laws that demanded obedience without offering meaning, from moral systems that felt imposed rather than shared. This alienation did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated. And as it accumulated, the need for explanation returned. Not theological explanation. Structural explanation. Why do these systems exist? What are they trying to produce? Who benefits from their design? At this point, the argument that had once seemed unlivable began to look practical, not comforting, but useful. A system that explained behavior through cause and effect offered tools where moral language had failed. It allowed reform without blame, adjustment without condemnation, intervention without pretending that suffering was deserved. This is why the ideas did not disappear. They migrated out of philosophy into policy, into education, into social theory, quietly, often without attribution. Determinism did not need to be named to be applied. Once institutions began designing environments to shape behavior, they were already acting on its assumptions. This was the final irony. The system that had been rejected as too cold, too complete, too dangerous, was being adopted in fragments everywhere. Without its honesty, without its discipline, without its refusal to moralize. The result was an uneasy hybrid. Belief without conviction. Management without admission. Power without accountability. And hybrids are unstable. Because they inherit the weaknesses of both sides, they lack the comfort of belief. They lack the clarity of full explanation. They demand obedience without offering meaning. This is the state the Enlightenment drifted into. Not failure, but unresolved tension. The world continued to function, but it no longer knew why it demanded what it demanded. At this point, the argument that had once been contained could no longer be dismissed as abstract. It described what was already happening, and once an explanation matches reality, resistance weakens. Not because people like it, but because denial becomes harder to maintain. The question was no longer whether society could survive without belief. It already was. The question was whether it could do so honestly, or whether it would continue replacing meaning with control while pretending nothing had changed. That question remained unanswered, but the direction was clear. Once belief stops doing the work, something else always will, and whatever replaces it will demand a price. The change did not arrive as shock. It arrived as effort. Life continued to look familiar on the surface. People still worked, married, raised children, argued, reconciled. Moral language remained in circulation. Institutions still demanded compliance. The world did not suddenly feel empty. It felt heavier. What belief had once carried quietly now had to be carried consciously. This was the psychological cost no one had planned for. In a religious world, obligation came preloaded. One did not need to invent reasons to behave. The reasons were already there. Authority was external. Meaning was inherited. Failure could be folded into a larger story that promised correction elsewhere. In the emerging world, nothing arrived, pre-assembled. Every justification had to be constructed. Every restraint had to be explained. Every sacrifice required an argument strong enough to withstand doubt. This did not produce immediate rebellion. It produced fatigue. People began to feel the difference between obeying and believing, between acting out of habit and acting out of conviction, between following rules because they were sacred and following them because consequences were visible. The effort was subtle but cumulative. Moral decisions took longer. Certainty thinned. Actions once taken for granted began to require internal negotiation. Why this, and not something else? Why now, and not later? Why should this cost be paid if no one beyond the world records it? These questions did not feel philosophical. They felt practical. And they followed people into ordinary moments. The result was not moral collapse. It was moral strain. In the absence of an external witness, the individual became the final arbiter of meaning. That role had once belonged to heaven, tradition, or law. Now it sat uncomfortably inside the self. Not everyone wanted it. Some tried to offload the burden back onto institutions. They followed rules strictly, not out of belief, but out of relief. Clear procedure replaced internal judgment. Obedience became a way of escaping deliberation. Others went the opposite direction. They treated morality as negotiable, context, bound, flexible. If meaning was constructed, then it could be revised. If no act echoed eternally, then every act became lighter. Both strategies shared the same root. Avoidance. Avoidance of standing alone with consequence. The Enlightenment had promised liberation from superstition. It had not promised this level of responsibility. This was where psychological tension deepened. People sensed that something had been removed, but could not name it without sounding nostalgic or irrational. They were told this was progress. That clarity was an improvement, that the old world had been cruel and arbitrary. All of that was true. And yet something essential had gone missing. Not comfort, orientation. Belief had not only explained suffering, it had organized it. It told people where pain belonged in the larger picture. It gave loss a direction, even when that direction was harsh. Without it, suffering became episodic rather than meaningful. It occurred, but it did not point anywhere. This made endurance harder. Not because suffering increased, but because it stopped arriving with a story attached. People noticed this absence most clearly in moments of failure, when effort did not pay off, when virtue went unrewarded, when cruelty went unanswered. In the old world, these moments were deferred. Justice would arrive later. Meaning would be restored elsewhere. In the new one, nothing arrived, only continuation. This was not despair. It was exposure. Exposure to a world that no longer promised redemption for effort. This exposure altered how people related to one another. Compassion became harder to justify abstractly. Why sacrifice for someone whose suffering did not fit into a cosmic plan? Why restrain oneself when restraint earned no metaphysical credit? These questions did not produce selfishness overnight. They produced calculation. People began weighing actions differently, not morally, but instrumentally. What works, what stabilizes, what minimizes cost. The language of virtue remained, but it increasingly described outcomes rather than intentions. Good became what functioned. Bad became what disrupted. This was a quiet transformation, and it unsettled those who sensed that something irreplaceable had been lost, but could not articulate it without invoking the very beliefs they no longer trusted. The Enlightenment had stripped away illusion. It had not yet provided orientation. Between those two facts, a psychological gap opened. People stood inside it without vocabulary. To live honestly in a world without appeals required constant authorship. Meaning had to be made and remade, not discovered. Values had to be defended without reference to authority beyond the world. This was possible, but it was demanding, and not everyone could sustain it indefinitely. Some hardened. They accepted indifference and built identities around endurance. If the universe did not care, neither would they. Emotional distance became a form of control. Others sought replacement narratives, not religious ones, but systems that offered direction, sacrifice, and moral clarity without invoking heaven. They filled a gap left by the removal of guaranteed meaning. This is where the story turns, not toward despair, but toward substitution. When belief stopped absorbing psychological weight, that weight did not vanish. It was reassigned. Human beings do not live without orientation for long. When guaranteed meaning is removed, something else moves in to organize effort, sacrifice, and restraint. Not always consciously, not deliberately, reliably. The first replacements did not announce themselves as substitutes. They presented as improvements. Reason would replace revelation. Progress would replace providence. History would replace heaven. These ideas were not false. They were incomplete. They offered direction without absolution, movement without forgiveness, purpose without transcendence. At first, this felt sufficient. If meaning could no longer be discovered, it could be produced. If suffering was no longer explained, it could be justified by outcome. If sacrifice earned no eternal reward, it could be redeemed by contribution to something larger and longer lasting. This is how abstraction returned. Not upward, forward. People placed their weight on ideas that promised continuity beyond the individual, nations, causes, futures, the slow arc of improvement. The belief that effort mattered because it advanced something that would outlive the self. You could hear this shift in language. Policies defended as necessary for progress. Hardship framed as the price of advancement. Cruelty justified as unavoidable because history was moving forward. Harm was no longer tragic. It was required. These frameworks did not require God, but they behaved like Him. They offered narrative. They assigned virtue. They demanded loyalty. They explained loss as necessary rather than meaningless. They turned endurance into contribution. And once endurance is framed as contribution, suffering becomes tolerable again. This was not deception. It was necessity. A world without appeals still demands justification for pain. These substitute meanings spread because they worked. They organized populations. They motivated sacrifice. They stabilized behavior. But they also inherited the dangers of the belief systems they replaced. They demanded coherence. They punished deviation. They explained failure as moral weakness rather than structural design. The difference was that these systems claimed to be rational. They insisted they were grounded in history, material conditions, or inevitable progress rather than divine will. But inevitability, once invoked, performs the same psychological function regardless of its source. It reassures. It excuses. It absolves. Responsibility, which had briefly become fully human, began to drift outward again, not upward to heaven, but outward to systems. If history demanded sacrifice, then suffering was necessary. If progress required hardship, then pain was justified. If the future would redeem the present, then cruelty could be deferred. These arguments sounded modern. They were ancient. They replaced God's plan with history's logic. And logic, when treated as destiny, becomes unquestionable. At first, this felt like relief. People no longer had to invent meaning alone. Identity could be anchored to participation rather than authorship. But this relief came with conditions. Substitute systems demanded conformity. Doubt became disloyalty. Skepticism became obstruction. What had once been a psychological burden became a political one. Because once meaning is outsourced to a system, dissent threatens not just ideas, but purpose itself. This was the paradox. The Enlightenment had not resolved. It removed one absolute only to watch others take its place. Not gods. Histories, not commandments. Trajectories, not salvation. Futures. These systems claimed to know where things were going. That claim mattered more than its accuracy. Because direction calms anxiety, even false direction. The more human beings tried to escape metaphysical guarantees, the more eagerly they accepted secular ones. Guarantees that suffering would be redeemed by progress, that injustice would be corrected by time, that failure was temporary because history moved forward. These ideas did not require faith, but they functioned on it. They asked people to endure now for outcomes they would never personally see, to sacrifice without immediate reward, to trust that the system knew where it was going. This trust replaced prayer, and, like prayer, it could be abused. Once progress becomes sacred, opposition becomes immoral. Once history is treated as a force, individuals become expendable. Once the future is invoked as justification, present cruelty becomes negotiable. This is not where the Enlightenment intended to arrive, but it is where unresolved psychological need leads. The removal of God did not eliminate the human desire for meaning that exceeds the individual. It redirected it. And redirection, when unmanaged, hardens. The systems that absorbed this desire grew more confident. They spoke in the language of inevitability. They framed themselves as necessary. They demanded sacrifice not because it was good, but because it was required. This was the return of absolutes, disguised as reason. The tragedy was not that people believed these systems. It was that they needed them. A world without appeals still demands justification for suffering. And if no appeal exists beyond the world, justification will be manufactured within it. At this point, the cost of removing guaranteed meaning became clear. It did not free humanity from illusion. It forced humanity to invent new ones, more efficient, more rational, more dangerous, because unlike gods, these systems did not promise mercy. They promised results, and results, once elevated above people, excuse almost anything. Belief had been removed. Orientation had not yet been rebuilt responsibly. And until it was, whatever could carry the weight would be asked to do so. Whether it should, the substitute systems did not fail immediately. That is why they were convincing. They organized effort. They stabilized behavior. They justified sacrifice. For a time, they even felt humane. History gave suffering direction. Progress gave hardship meaning. The future absorbed pain the present could not justify. But substitutes, like belief before them, were asked to do too much. They were not only meant to explain the world, they were meant to excuse it. This is where strain returned. Not as rebellion, as contradiction. The promise embedded in these systems was simple: endure now, and coherence will arrive later. Sacrifice today, and meaning will be restored by outcome. Trust the process, and the future will redeem the present. That promise worked only as long as the future remained abstract. As long as results were deferred, no one could measure them. But abstraction has limits. Eventually, systems are judged by what they produce, and when they are, the gap between promise and reality becomes visible. Progress did not move evenly. History did not correct injustice reliably. Sacrifice did not distribute itself fairly. Some endured more than others. Some benefited without suffering. Some paid costs they would never see repaid. These disparities were not new. What was new was how difficult they were to justify. In a religious world, inequality could be folded into mystery. Injustice could be deferred to judgment beyond time. Suffering could be explained as trial, punishment, or providence. In the substitute world, no such appeal existed. History did not judge. Progress did not correct. The future did not guarantee redress. These systems had been asked to function like moral authorities. They could not. They were descriptive, not redemptive. And once that distinction became visible, the psychological strain returned with greater force. People began to notice the language fraying. Sacrifice was still demanded, but justification sounded thinner. Hardship was still framed as necessary, but necessity increasingly felt selective. Appeals to inevitability lost their calming effect and began to sound evasive. This produced a new kind of discomfort. Not about meaning, about fairness. Why should some lives be treated as expendable for outcomes they would never reach? Why should suffering be justified by futures that did not include those who paid the price? These questions did not emerge from ideology. They emerged from experience. The substitute systems had promised coherence. What they delivered was uneven consequence. This is where collision began. Institutions responded predictably. They doubled down. When outcomes disappointed, commitment intensified. When progress faltered, sacrifice was reframed as insufficient. When history failed to redeem suffering, the solution was more endurance, not reconsideration. The logic was circular. If the system failed, it must not have been applied strongly enough. This move preserved authority. But it eroded trust, because once inevitability is used to excuse failure, it loses its explanatory power. It stops feeling like truth. It starts feeling like insulation. At this stage, something briefly stabilized. Compliance increased. Dissent quieted. Procedures tightened. From the outside, the system appeared calmer than before, more orderly, more unified. The language of necessity smoothed disagreement into silence. Sacrifice became routine. Direction felt restored. But this calm was not resolution. It was compression. Pressure had not disappeared. It had been packed inward. This is where pressure changed character. It was no longer psychological fatigue alone. It became moral resentment, not against meaning, against its distribution. People began to sense that sacrifice was not shared equally, that suffering was being justified upward, while costs flowed downward. This was not yet revolt. It was recognition. Recognition that substitutes, like beliefs before them, were being asked to do work they could not complete. They could organize effort. They could motivate sacrifice. They could not absorb injustice. They could not redeem it. And once this was understood, a new danger appeared. If substitute systems could not justify suffering, then suffering became naked, and naked suffering demands explanation or resistance. The Enlightenment had removed one appeal, only to discover that its replacements also had limits, not because they were false, but because they were finite. History could not guarantee meaning. Progress could not promise justice. The future could not absolve the present. This realization did not dismantle the systems immediately. It destabilized them. Because once inevitability loses credibility, control must increase to compensate. When meaning weakens, enforcement strengthens. Rules tightened. Deviation narrowed. Dissent was reframed as obstruction. The systems did not become cruel. They became defensive. And defensiveness always signals fragility. This is where the Enlightenment crossed into its next phase. Not confidence. Containment. The question was no longer how to explain the world. It was how to manage the consequences of explanations that no longer worked as promised. Once substitutes began to fail, neutrality was no longer possible. Systems that had justified themselves through inevitability now had to justify themselves through enforcement. The language shifted first. Sacrifice became obligation. Necessity hardened into requirement. Dissent was no longer disagreement. It was obstruction. This was the point of no return. From this moment on, suffering was no longer framed as unfortunate but necessary, and necessity itself became the test of loyalty. What mattered was no longer whether sacrifice worked, but who accepted it without resistance. This did not announce itself as repression. It arrived as protection. Institutions framed their response as safeguarding progress, preserving stability, defending the future. The logic was familiar. If the system represented history's direction, Then resistance threatened more than policy. It threatened meaning itself. This reframing mattered, because once meaning is attached to a system's survival, any challenge becomes morally suspect. Opposition is no longer mistaken. It is dangerous. This is how containment became explicit, not through spectacle or violence, but through narrowing legitimacy. Certain questions could still be asked. Others were quietly marked as irresponsible, premature, or destabilizing. The boundary was not drawn around truth. It was drawn around usefulness. Ideas were tolerated not because they were correct, but because they did not interfere with function. Critique was welcomed so long as it did not challenge direction. Skepticism was allowed, provided it did not interrupt momentum. This was the new rule. Meaning had to serve outcomes, and outcomes had to justify cost. As confidence eroded, oversight expanded, not to punish belief, to manage behavior. Law became increasingly procedural. Decisions were justified through consistency rather than justice. What mattered was not whether outcomes were right, but whether they were applied uniformly. Education followed the same logic. Judgment was replaced with optimization. Understanding gave way to training. The goal was not moral formation, but functional alignment. Individuals were shaped to fit systems rather than taught to evaluate them. None of this felt tyrannical. It felt administrative. And administration, when it replaces meaning, grows quickly. What belief had once restrained internally now had to be monitored externally. Where conscience weakened, procedure filled the gap. Where trust thinned, verification multiplied. The result was a culture of compliance without conviction. People followed rules because they were enforced, not because they were shared. Agreement became less important than predictability. Order was preserved, but at the cost of internal assent. This is the trade substitutes always demand. They offer direction. They require obedience. The danger was not that people noticed this. It was that they adapted to it. Adaptation is quieter than resistance. People learned how to function within systems they no longer believed in. They learned which questions to ask and which to avoid. They learned how to signal loyalty without internal commitment. This produced a peculiar stability, not cohesion. Alignment. Alignment is thinner. It holds until pressure increases, and pressure always increases. As enforcement replaced explanation, the moral language surrounding authority changed. Decisions were defended as necessary rather than just. Outcomes were praised for efficiency rather than fairness. Responsibility was framed in terms of compliance rather than judgment. The systems did not abandon morality. They redefined it. Good became what preserved order. Bad became what disrupted function. This shift was subtle, but it was decisive.
Because once morality is reduced to outcome management, cruelty becomes tolerable if it works. Suffering becomes acceptable if it serves direction. Individuals become secondary to process. This was the final cost of substitution made explicit. The Enlightenment had sought to remove illusions. Instead, it had produced new ones, more rational, more efficient, more demanding. The promise was clarity. The reality was control. And control, once it replaces belief, cannot admit failure without dissolving its own justification. That is the trap. A system that governs through inevitability cannot acknowledge contingency. A system that demands sacrifice cannot concede uncertainty. To do so would expose suffering as unnecessary rather than required, and so correction becomes impossible. The system must insist it is right, even when it is wrong. It must preserve direction, even when direction produces damage. It must silence questions not because they are false, but because they threaten coherence. At that point, resistance is no longer a reaction. It becomes a measure of whether responsibility still belongs to human beings, or whether it has been fully surrendered to systems that claim to know where history is going. And the unsettling possibility is this: by the time resistance becomes visible, the system no longer sees it as dissent. It sees it as malfunction.
What disappeared was not belief. What disappeared was somewhere to send responsibility. When appeal collapsed, responsibility did not dissolve. It condensed. It lost its vertical outlet and remained trapped within the world. And responsibility without release is not empowering. It is threatening. At first, this threat was invisible. Responsibility was treated as a virtue, a sign of maturity. To act without appeal was framed as progress. To stand alone with consequence was celebrated as moral adulthood. But responsibility carried directly does not scale. It exposes the individual to finality. It offers no deferral, no external justification, no higher ledger where failure can be absorbed. Every choice lands fully. Every error remains unreconciled. Every outcome closes. That kind of finality is tolerable in isolated moments. It is not tolerable as a permanent condition. This is where responsibility began to move, not upward, not outward, sideways. The movement did not announce itself as avoidance. It presented as prudence, as professionalism, as institutional maturity. Responsibility was not rejected. It was reorganized. The first move was narrowing. Instead of asking who was responsible for outcomes, systems began asking who was responsible for process. If procedures were followed, responsibility was considered satisfied. Harm became unfortunate rather than culpable. Error became a deviation from protocol rather than a failure of judgment. This was not deception. It was relief. Because responsibility attached to outcomes is unlimited. Responsibility attached to procedure has edges. Boundaries make responsibility bearable. But this narrowing carried a cost. Once responsibility is defined procedurally, it no longer reaches the point where decisions are felt. It stops before conscience. It touches authorization, not authorship. And that boundary, once drawn, does not easily dissolve. The second move was diffusion. Decisions were broken into stages. Authority was distributed across roles, departments, committees, and timelines. No single person saw the whole consequence. No single moment contained the full cost. This felt collaborative. It was also anesthetic. Diffusion reduced exposure. It softened the shock of consequence. It allowed action without confrontation with finality. And once responsibility is sufficiently diffused, it no longer wounds. When responsibility no longer wounds, it no longer corrects. The third move was deferral. Consequences were acknowledged but postponed. Reviews were scheduled. Reforms were promised. Adjustments were planned for later phases. Responsibility remained technically intact, but practically suspended. Time became a buffer, and buffers protect systems from collapse. Together, these moves transformed responsibility from a moral force into an administrative condition. It became something to be documented rather than felt, something to be managed rather than carried. This transformation was adaptive. It was also irreversible, because once responsibility is proceduralized, returning it to the individual requires exposure the system can no longer tolerate. Reversing the process would mean reintroducing unbuffered finality, and systems built to persist do not voluntarily reintroduce existential risk. This is where the emotional consequence surfaced, not as outrage, as hesitation, as risk aversion, as a quiet fear of authorship. People learned how to act without fully deciding, how to comply without committing, how to move forward while avoiding the experience of being the final cause. This produced a strange moral climate. Harm could occur without guilt. Suffering could persist without blame. Decisions could be defended without being justified. The system remained clean. The outcomes did not. This was not because people had become indifferent. It was because responsibility had been lifted off the self and embedded into structure. Procedure absorbed shock. It also absorbed conscience. At this stage, responsibility existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Everyone participated. No one decided. The system advanced without a clear author. This was safer than the alternative. Direct responsibility requires standing alone with consequence. It requires the possibility of being wrong in a way that cannot be repaired. Structure offered shelter. It allowed action without exposure. It transformed moral risk into operational risk. This is why responsibility moved sideways, not because people were weak, but because responsibility without appeal becomes unbearable at scale. Yet this adaptation carried a deeper cost. When responsibility is proceduralized, it loses its anticipatory force. It cannot intervene before harm occurs. It can only respond afterward, through review, adjustment, and explanation. Ethics stopped orienting the future. It began auditing the past. This was the moment moral life changed character. Decisions were no longer evaluated at the point of choice, but after outcome. Responsibility became retrospective, explanatory, corrective rather than preventative. The future was no longer guided. It was audited. Audit culture felt rational. It felt fair. It promised improvement through analysis rather than judgment. But analysis cannot replace responsibility. It can describe harm. It cannot prevent it. And prevention is where responsibility once lived. This is the paradox the Enlightenment did not foresee. By removing appeal in the name of honesty, responsibility was forced to remain within the world. But once trapped inside finite systems, responsibility sought escape routes of its own. Sideways movement was one of them. Not denial. Adaptation. This adaptation stabilized institutions. It also hollowed them. Because when responsibility no longer lands anywhere, legitimacy becomes performative. Authority continues to function, but it no longer feels answerable. Decisions are made, defended, and implemented without anyone experiencing themselves as the final cause. This condition defines the modern world. Not moral collapse, moral displacement. Responsibility did not vanish. It lost its address. And responsibility without an address cannot interrupt harm. This is the problem no procedure can solve. Because procedure exists to distribute responsibility, not to carry it. The question that remains is not whether responsibility can exist without appeal. It clearly can. The question is whether responsibility can remain human once it has nowhere to go. That question does not belong to theory. It belongs to the structures we build next, and to whether we are willing to feel the weight we have learned to move aside.